As soon as I felt the tug, I knew what was going on. Oh, she looks this way. She looks this way. Thank goodness.
This is what
I guess I had a last Christmas. Oh. You got it.
usually, I usually read some of these questions on that. Yep. Yeah, there's 7 or 8 of them in there. Sometimes you might have a little more kids, but most of that quality there's. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? I can hear me just fine, but. So last week, we discussed behaviors that have negative effects on relationships. And so this week, based on that discussion, we're going to begin to examine ways to develop and nurture our relationships with each other. Emphasis this time is going to be more along the line, you got a whole list of things you know not to do now. And that is a place to start. And then we'll do it again a little bit later in the class on some more positive aspects of what we can do to nurture our relationships. So this is our express review. A relationship is a way in which one or more concepts, objects, or people are connected. The emphasis on people for this particular class. The other types of relationships are interesting, but we're focusing on people. Relationships are important to all aspects of our health. Mental, physical, emotional, spiritual. And we must learn to steward and take proper care of our relationships. So, from last week's discussion, this is the same 4 questions that we asked last week and that you guys sat around and talked about a bit. What are some behaviors people consistently use that have a negative effect on a relationship? How does it harm the recipient? How do most people respond to these behaviors, and what would be a better way to respond? So, negative behaviors. And this is the notes that I took from your discussion last week. Negativity. Everything's a disaster. Everything is, going downhill. Negativity sometimes manifests itself in a peculiar way. So, for example, if you've ever told somebody, hey, I cut my hand and I had to get 6 stitches in it, and they say, well, that ain't nothing. I cut off both hands at the wrist and my left ear, So whatever it is that you had, they've got one that's way worse than that. Negativity is very popular in our news media today because that's the thing that gets eyeballs on screens or on paper. And more people look at it, more ads. So it's very popular. Narcissism, selfishness, a sense of entitlement, a lack of empathy, a need for admiration. Basically, this is, I am very fascinated with me, therefore you are very fascinated with me. But if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, they tend to try to dominate everything, and it really is all about them from their perspective. And if you're going to be in the relationship, it's all about them. Alcoholism, addictive behavior. There are a number of addictive behaviors and just about any addictive behavior that can harm a relationship, and especially so when the addict is either unaware of the addiction or the addict is making no effort to manage or recover from the addiction. They call it an addiction for a reason because that person is laser focused on this thing. They're obsessive about this thing. And so that's that's going to have an effect on the relationships with the people around them. Malicious sarcasm. And really the idea here is not having a sarcastic sense of humor, it's using your sarcastic sense of humor as a weapon to constantly belittle and befuddle and treat people like they're worthless and things like that. It degrades somebody's self-worth. Argumentative, loves to argue about everything. People like that drive me nuts. And my go-to in that type of a situation, on the rare times that I've encountered it, is, you'll see it on one of the future view foils. And I'll give you a hint, it's in red, so it was not a good idea to do that. Blaming others, refusing to take personal responsibility. A lot of times if you're dealing with somebody who is a narcissist, this is one of their go-tos. When things go wrong, it's your fault. You're the one who messed it up. Even if, by messing it up, it means I didn't beat you about the head and shoulders trying to get you not to do that to begin with. It's still your fault. That gets a little tiresome and tedious, and it's very unfair. Inconsistent body language, a nonverbal response that doesn't match words and or normal behaviors. It's kind of like, oh, you got married, yay, I'm so happy for you. Really? Did you get that from me looking at my phone? Lying or dishonesty. This causes serious trust issues, and it can cause other forms of harm as well. When you're trying to evaluate everything somebody says, are you telling me the truth? Are you being honest about this? And you can't tell, but you've got a reasonable probability that they're wrong. That's a problem. You may be needing information to act upon from them, or describing a relationship or something like that, but something's not right in the way that what they're telling you and what they're actually doing. In a good relationship, Proverbs 27:17 says, iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. In a good relationship, both parties are deriving benefit from each other in here. The differences in perspective, or the differences in experience, or even personality, or things like that, are useful to both parties in the relationship. The reason you had that discussion last week is because my friend and my wife both suggested you ought to do a discussion group. I was a little bit apprehensive about that. So we gave it a try. It turned out pretty well. A lot of good information out of it. That's iron sharpening iron. However, these negative behaviors are acid or water. They're rusting the iron and making it unfit to use, so they will degrade people in the relationship. You will not get a positive outcome when a relationship is dominated by these types of behaviors. Any questions or comments or thoughts so far?
You got one on there, or you have one, it's kind of tied to your lying and dishonesty, but I think it's one I've seen in corporate America for 30 plus years, is the passive aggressive behavior, which I think falls into that, but it's a horrible behavior, because it's saying one thing and then going out and talking the opposite afterwards. And it falls under lying, really, but it's a rampant behavior lately, if you ask me. It's gotten worse.
Yeah, because one of that is true, and one of the reasons is because it's usually the underling that does, whoever's in charge, it's the person they're in charge of that does that. And literally what they're doing in there is they're agreeing at the time that it's done, and then if they're doing anything at all, they're doing it as sorry and as bad attitude as they possibly can, or they're simply doing nothing. Yeah, that is true. I have been accused of that quite justifiably at times. So, anything else? Okay, from experience, talked about this a little bit last week. Everyone has experienced these kinds of behaviors in one or more ways. Either you've observed someone behave this way to someone else, and and depending on the situation, your intervention was probably may not have been welcomed, or maybe you were just a little bit worried about it, or maybe we were kind of looking at it and say, well, it's a good thing that wasn't me. I'm glad that wasn't me on the receiving end of that. Sometimes something like this has been directed at us by someone else, so now you know what that feels like if you can't relate to the first bullet point. Or the third option, we've done this to someone else, and most of us, if we're being honest about it, have exhibited some form of these behavior to somebody else. So it's a problem, and we need to learn how to handle it and deal with it correctly. So, what relationship do we want? Generally speaking, when you start off in a friend relationship, you have something that you share in common, a common interest or a common goal or a common something or other that causes you to interact with this individual and build a relationship with them. In online gaming, they always have a friends list there. So that if you're playing Call of Duty or something like that, and there's somebody that you like playing with, you can put them on your friends list and see what they're doing whenever they're on the game, or they can see what you're doing when you're on the game and meet up and do whatever it is that you do in that particular game. And that works for a while, but eventually everybody stops playing the game. So the relationship, when the interest is gone, the relationship is gone after that. Maybe you meet up in some other game. But we generally start off with that. But the way we treat each other defines both the relationship we currently have and the relationship we want to have. Now, that relationship is going to grow in some direction. As your interests expand or your interactions expand, your familiarity expands, you come to appreciate each other, something like that, the relationship has an opportunity to grow. Or if we're wrapped up in negative behaviors or something like that, if one of the parties in the relationship is a narcissist, that's a hard one to get along with, and that relationship will grow in some fashion. It's just not going to grow the way you want it unless you're the narcissist. But it will determine that. Good relationships have common trust, common interests, common goals, and when one of those is lacking, interest, trust, common, that kind of thing, there's a problem. When one person treats another with disdain, there is a problem. You may need that relationship. If you are employed, you have worked with a coworker that's a pain in the neck. You have worked for somebody that doesn't have a clue what they're doing and tries to get you to do, these things. Some people have had problems with bosses who want them to do something borderline illegal and then cover up the fact that they did it. And the interesting thing about that is often if you get caught doing the borderline illegal thing, that boss will also throw you under the bus for it. If there's a consequence to be had, they're not taking it, even though they told you to do that. So when you have a relationship that you need, you have to navigate that very carefully. When the relationship is purely voluntary, though, that's when we have a little bit more options for control and things like that. So how these things harm the recipient. This is again from the notes. They greatly reduce trust and eliminate conversation, meaning the exchange of information and point of view discussions. You're going to be very, very careful how you communicate to somebody you do not trust, because that information can and will be used against you in some fashion. The recipient must consistently maintain a defensive posture. You have to do that just for self-protection, and that's a very, very harsh environment to try to live in. It's not like we're supposed to be at war. At war, at least you understand that. In conflict, you understand that, but this is not supposed to be that way, and yet that's what we have to do. And these behaviors can have long-term negative effect on a recipient's self-esteem. If you want to convert somebody to your cult, there's kind of a process that you can go through that will almost guarantee it. You got to be at them constantly. Sleep deprivation often helps too, and things like that. But these types of things can be used to take a person that's otherwise normal and make them, a cult fanatic. So you don't want a relationship to get anywhere near that kind of territory. So, you do have to deal with it. So how do we deal with this? So how do we deal with this toxic behavior? Well, another question that you want to ask also is, how important is this relation to me? How important is this relationship to us? If you're working for somebody like this, you may have to see if you can transfer out of the group or do, something like that. But you can't, maybe you might have options there. One way to do this is to fight fire with fire. You like to argue, I like to argue more. You like negativity, I can be negative more. You like open hostility or passive aggressive, I can do it more. Now, in many cases, this actually reinforces the negative behavior. If you're dealing with somebody who's very argumentative and you try to argue with them, you're in their home field. You are this is what they live for. You're playing their game, and oddly enough, they love that if you can fight fire with fire. Other types of harsh behavior and things like that, you have to make some moral compromises or something like that. And if the behavior is actually a sin, then what you're doing is committing to commit a sin, really. Fighting with fire doesn't really work. The only case I can think of where it does kind of work is if you're fighting a forest fire or a major fire like that. Sometimes they will do what's called a controlled burn. And the idea behind that is to burn out some brush here between the fire and, say, the town, so that the fire can't cross that and go burn the town down. That doesn't always work. You remember the big fires out west early last summer in northern New Mexico? You know what caused that? A controlled burn that got out of control. So it doesn't always work. And even if it does work, and sometimes things like that, you and I do not possess the skills to do that in a relationship. We don't know how to do that. And it's kind of a waste of time to do that. So the second option that we sometimes do is to quietly withdraw from the relationship. Okay, you're a negative jerk or a narcissist or something like that. Whatever you call or want to do something, I've already got plans that night. I'll ghost you if I can, and if I can't avoid that, then I will just simply withdraw. I don't need to see you anymore. And that does protect us from it, but it doesn't tell the other person why we're not in this relationship anymore. And so they are oblivious maybe to the reason, and they go off and find somebody else to be friends with where they can exercise this type of negative behavior with somebody else. I mean, this is a pattern for them usually. So those are the bad options. The good option, explain the harm being done and ask them to correct the behavior. Give them a chance to change. Why?
It may save the relationship.
It may save the relationship, right. If the behavior that they do is particularly harmful, you might save a soul out of that. But the idea is to deal with it and give them a chance to change. Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 17 provides a template for corrective behavior. And I've got it up here on a PowerPoint, so you don't even need to look at your Bibles. Beginning in verse 15, and if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or more with you, so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses every fact may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax gatherer. Now, this passage is talking about something very specific. It is talking about sin. Now, that can relate to a relationship problem, because usually when somebody's in the business of harming somebody else in a relationship, there's often sin involved in that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. But it is talking about sin. And then it is go and reprove in private in that circumstance. Now, if you think about this a little bit more, like how we tend to do things in real life, or other people might tend to do things, notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say if your brother sins against you or anything like that, or has negative aspects of the relationship, kick his sorry carcass out the door. And then make him or her come crawling back on their hands and knees, begging for your forgiveness. Reject it at least 2 times before on the 3rd time you finally condescend to give in to them and let them know how magnanimous you are by offering to forgive them, subject to conditions and stipulations. That's the way I want to do it. I want to be in charge of this thing on the other end of it. But that's not what it says. There's a problem, you go and you reprove in private. And that's the same thing in the relationship. If you're trying to correct a behavior, that's where we're going to start at. Now, verses 16 and 17 are an escalation there. In a relationship, maybe not so much, but sometimes if a relationship involves a sin that they won't correct, it can get bad enough that you'd have to consider disfellowshipping that individual. But the idea is talk first, try to solve the problem and get it worked out, and then escalate if that doesn't work. And the idea, I think, between having 2 or 3, their witnesses isn't necessarily did they witness the behavior as much are they witnessing the discussion that you're having with the person who's having the problem. And it can be both, yes.
The notable component is also it's not appropriate often immediately to bring in a third party. That you should try to work it out just between the two of you if you can, and that's what makes sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is because he wouldn't listen to you, So you win it privately if you can, if that, then escalate it if you need to. All right, anything else? So, how to discuss this correctly? First and foremost, demeanor is important. If you're going to have this conversation with somebody, why are you having it? What is your goal? And you need to operate from the position of love, agape. You care about this person, you care about their soul, you care about this relationship. If you come in with another attitude, like I really want to get even, or I really want to put you in your place, or I really want you to understand how badly you've hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you. If you come in with another attitude, it'll show it. You won't hide it very long. So you need to come in with the attitude, I care about you, and I care about this relationship. Now, if you really don't, you've probably already demonstrated that in the relationship to begin with, and so it's going to ring kind of hollow. But if you've tried to build a proper relationship, you've already should have the evidence on your side that says, I care about you and I care about this relationship. Then the second thing to do, focus on the behavior and not the person's motive or character. So we're having this discussion because you have been behaving this way, and it's harmful to me, it's harmful to other people, and you need to change the behavior to something else. I care about you, even if you want and need to say that, that's fine. That's a little bit different than you have this behavior and I'm trying to get you to change it, but when you get right down to it, I don't think you were ever taught very well, and maybe it's because you're so genetically inferior that you weren't smart enough to pick up on proper training anyway, and you really like being this way. The judgmental stuff doesn't go into this conversation. You don't need to make any assumptions about, their true nature or their lack of mental empathy or any of these types of things. Just, this is the behavior, this needs to stop. Now, in having that particular discussion, there is no guarantee that discussing this behavior will be successful in curing this behavior. This is a human being, and just like all other human beings, they have a choice to make. They get to make that particular choice, however they want it to go. And if they don't want to go that way, they don't want to change, then you tried, and it's not going to work. There is a 100% guarantee that not discussing it will not resolve the behavior. It's kind of odd, but some people are actually unaware of their behavior in these types of areas. And understanding oneself, there's really what you know about yourself, what other people know about you. There's what you know about yourself that they don't know, but there's also what they know about you that you don't know. And so it is possible that we are unaware of certain behaviors. I'll give you an example of that. When our grandson was about 4 years old, Jackie and I were working out in the living room or something like that. We had these little hand weights and we're doing this. And we're jumping around and pumping and doing this and all of this kind of stuff like that, and sweating. And my grandson, Asher, is a mimic of human behavior that he observes. And so as I set the weight down and I'm doing something else, I look around and he's got the weight and he's kind of going. Now, who do you think he's behaving like? I didn't know. I didn't know it looked like that, but to him, that's what it looked like, and he mimicked the behavior. Huh? Yeah, he did. He picked up the same one. It's just like a little 3-pound weight, and he's sitting there doing this and grunting and making all of these faces and stuff like that. I didn't know. I wished he'd have done Jackie. I think that would have been a lot more funny, but he didn't. He did Grandpa. So. And I do watch him a lot more after that incident because find out what else that I'm doing that's weird that he notices, because he will notice it. But there are things that we don't know about ourselves, and maybe there's a possibility that the individual is not self-aware enough to know, number one, this is what I'm doing, and this is the impact it's having. So that's why one of the reasons the discussion is important to have. But if you don't have it, nothing's going to change. They have nothing at stake to change until, you tell them this is what you're doing, and this is why it hurts, and this is why you need to change it. So have that conversation. Any questions or comments at this point? Okay. So, looking around for some ways to kind of summarize what we've been talking about so far on this. And looking in the book of Ephesians, I found 4 specific commands that are relationship commands to us in the book of Ephesians. And I also kind of thought about this a little bit. When Paul writes Ephesians, this is one of the prison epistles. Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon are the 4 prison epistles. And then you have 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus that are written sometime around that time or a little bit later. But Paul has been, by the time he's writing this, a Christian roughly 30 years. And he's older now. Estimates have his age as being in his early, maybe mid-60s at this particular time. And we sometimes forget 2 things about Paul. Number one, the thing that we forget is Paul had to grow as an apostle. He wasn't any different than any of us are in the need that he had to develop and grow his skills and his service over time. He was very zealous about doing that, but there are probably, a few times when maybe he could have done things a little bit better, and so he's kind of having to grow. And number 2, he's at that point in life as he's looking back, and he's starting to tell people, this is what was really important. And if you look at this particular set of letters, the prison epistles, and then 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, he spends a lot of time in there talking about relationship between Christians. Why is that important, Paul? Because he's been an apostle for 30 years. He's watched people struggle with the fact that I'm a Greek and you're a Jew and we don't like each other. He's seen people do some crazy things or some sinful things and stuff like that have had to be corrected and dealt with. He's had to do a lot of teaching along these lines. And yet, even in these areas, he's talking about relationship with one another. So kind of keep that in mind when we're looking at these particular passages from Ephesians here. This is one of his final books that he's written in his life, and he spends a lot of time talking about this. So in Ephesians 5:21, he says, and be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. Hold the thought. Ephesians 4:1-3, I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, entreat you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing forbearance to one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. So I highlighted the 4 commands that, phrases that we really want to focus on here. Be subject to one another. Subject comes from a military term meaning to rank under. Now, in the military, there's pretty much a clear hierarchy here. If I'm looking at the stripes on my shoulder and I look at the stripes on your shoulder, I count them. Whoever's got the most stripes, that's the one that's in charge in that situation. But he says to Christians, be subject to one another. Rank yourself under one another. Be attentive to do what that person needs. We should see each other as someone we from me right now. It also implies a respect based on the relationship. We rank under one another because we have this relationship in Christ that teaches us that we need to do that and we need to pay this kind of attention to it. Walk in a manner worthy of your calling. Imitate both what Christ taught and did. We talk a lot about what Christ taught, but he was the one person on this earth at that time who talked the talk and walked the walk. He didn't just tell people, be this way to one another. He went out and did this way to one another. He's saying that's what the attitude that you need to have as an imitator of Christ. I mean, Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So there's your model, there's your example. You know what it is to do that. Show forbearance. This is from a Greek word that means to come to the side of or to hold up. Basically, to actively support one another. Usually when I read that word, I want to think of it's put up with one another. That's not what it's saying. It's saying get into the side and hold that person up. Whatever the situation is that they're struggling with, that they're falling down or what have you, you get in there and hold them up. And then be diligent to preserve unity and peace. Be attentive and quick to preserve unity and peace. And he emphasizes this a lot. Why? Because it's important. It's important that we be very aware of that. And when we're wanting to slide off the rails and go back to the old way of behaving and things like that, no, we're here to preserve unity and to preserve peace. And that requires effort on our part. So those are the 4 things he says out of there. Any questions or comments? So, for our closing thought, I want to turn to Isaiah 55, 6 through 9. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return to the Lord, and he will have compassion on him and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. We like to quote verses 8 and 9 to remind us that God is far smarter, wiser, and more understanding than we can comprehend. That's absolutely true statement. God looks at things and sees things far differently from the way that we are, and he's the one who has the power to set things in motion and do things that we're not even able to understand here. They do remind us that God is far more holy, righteous, and powerful than we can comprehend, but it should also remind us that God is far more compassionate and caring than we can comprehend. That's his emphasis there in verse 9. Let him, and the unrighteous man, let the wicked forsake his way and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return to the Lord, and he will have compassion on him. How many times does it say in that verse that he's going to do this? In verse 7. It's not like 3 strikes and you're out, is it? God's not going to hold a grudge in this situation. He wants us to repent, and he wants us to change, and he wants us to be with him, and he's willing to do whatever that takes. So that's also the ways that his ways are not our ways. He's not going to hold a grudge or keep score or anything like that. Just, give that up and get with him, and it's all, you're going to get a better outcome out of that than the other possibility. So God is eager to forgive and does not carry a grudge. God is eager to assist or provide for us beyond what we can understand. And we need to model our relationships on the same principles. This is getting back to the agape. What can I do that advances your eternal interests? If the relationship has a problem and you need to correct some behavior, I'm not doing you any favors not dealing with it. It's going to go uncorrected. Somebody has to deal with it. Somebody has to point it out, either the Bible or, if they're not doing, somebody has to get their attention on this. And that's kind of our responsibility. That is part of agape. So, everybody's going to have to learn to deal with problem relationships. It's a given. You have a relationship. You're going to have some type of a problem with it. We must also learn how not to become a relationship problem. That's really important too, underappreciated as an art form. And then finally, the best way to do this is to develop the character of Christ within us and reflect the love and compassion that he has shown to us. Do you want to kind of get a feel for where you are in Christ? Where are you in your relationships? Now, you're not going to be perfect in that, but are those relationships that you're investing in, are they growing? Are they bearing fruit? In that, are you able to communicate with people effectively? Do you serve effectively? Then you're in a healthy relationship. And that's one of the things that, that's one of the outcomes that we're going to get out of this class. And so I just kind of like spoiled the ending for you right there, but that's where we're going with it. Any closing thoughts or questions, comments? See you all next week then. Have a good evening.